It was the kind of night that made seasoned truck drivers like Ethan uneasy. The dense fog clung to the tires, and the moon hid behind thick clouds, leaving the highway shrouded in darkness. Ethan had been driving for over 15 years, but tonight, something felt different. The vast stretch of highway he was on felt isolated, as if the entire world had shut down around him. He had a long haul ahead, delivering a shipment to a remote town in Tennessee. The route was known for its desolation, a stretch of road that few dared to travel after dark. His headlights illuminated nothing but trees and shadows, the road stretching endlessly ahead. As he navigated through the dense forest, a sudden flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure standing alone on the side of the road, her arm raised. At first he thought it might be a trick of his tired eyes, but as he got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white dress, standing motionless in the middle of nowhere. Ethan's first instinct was to keep driving. The woman might be a stranded traveler or someone playing a cruel joke on him, but there was something in her stillness that unsettled him. He couldn't just leave her there, could he? His conscience tugged at him. After a brief moment of hesitation, he slowed the truck, rolling down the window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan's voice sounded louder than he expected in the silence that enveloped the road. The woman didn't respond. She simply raised her hand again, gesturing for help. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he couldn't just leave her stranded in the middle of nowhere. He stopped the truck and got out, keeping his eyes on the strange figure. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice shaky as he cautiously approached her. The woman didn't speak. Instead, she slowly moved toward him. Ethan watched as she approached the truck, her long white dress billowing in the wind, her face obscured by her dark, disheveled hair. Without a word, she climbed into the passenger seat, her cold presence filling the cabin. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked again, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But the woman remained silent. Ethan started the engine again, the sound of the truck's motor breaking the unnerving quiet of the night. As they drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His breath felt shallow, and the hairs on his neck stood up. He glanced at the woman next to him, but she didn't seem to notice him. Her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, her eyes dark and hollow. Minutes turned into hours as the truck rumbled down the road, and the uneasy tension in the air only grew. Suddenly, Ethan noticed something strange. The temperature inside the truck had dropped drastically. His breath fogged in front of him, and he felt an icy chill creeping up his spine. He reached to adjust the air conditioning, but it was turned off, yet the cold remained. He glanced over at the woman and his stomach sank. She was gone. The seat next to him, where she had been sitting moments ago, was now empty. He slammed on the brakes and looked around frantically. His heart raced as he scanned the road and the trees, but there was no sign of the woman. Confused and terrified, Ethan threw the truck in reverse and backed up. He searched desperately for her, but the road was empty. The eerie silence pressed in on him, the only sound his own rapid breathing. His hands were shaking, and the cold air seemed to press against his chest, suffocating him. Just as he was about to drive away, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of laughter, soft at first, but growing louder. It echoed all around him, coming from the trees, the sky, the very ground beneath him. The sound was otherworldly, twisted, and haunting. Ethan's heart raced as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting around the cabin. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it felt as though it was coming from within the truck itself. Suddenly, the woman's face appeared outside the window. Her features were contorted, her eyes glowing an unnatural red. She grinned at him, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body froze, his mind screaming in terror as the woman's distorted face pressed against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. With a sudden force, she slammed her hand against the glass, making Ethan jump in his seat. The glass rattled as if it were about to shatter. The woman's laughter grew louder, more insane, until it became deafening. Ethan tried to tear his eyes away from her, but it was as though she was pulling him in, trapping him in her gaze. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, she was gone. Ethan's breath came in short gasps as he looked around the truck, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. Sweat dripped from his brow as his heart raced in his chest. He tried to restart the truck, but it wouldn't start. His legs were stiff, his feet frozen to the floor. It was as if something was holding him in place. The woman's laughter echoed again, now coming from inside the truck. Ethan tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He screamed, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The air seemed to close in around him, suffocating him. He looked out the window again, and the woman was there, standing just outside, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. She raised her hand, slowly moving toward him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he realized there was no escape. He tried to open the door again, but it remained locked. His entire body was paralyzed with fear as the woman stepped closer, her eyes burning into his soul. With a final blood-curdling scream, Ethan lost consciousness, his body slumping against the wheel. The truck sat there abandoned, a faint trail of smoke curling up into the night air. The next morning, the truck was found, its engine still running, but there was no sign of Ethan. His disappearance was the latest in a long line of strange occurrences along the road. Locals spoke in hushed whispers about the Ghost Road, a stretch of highway that had earned a sinister reputation. Drivers who had passed through late at night reported seeing a woman in a white dress, her eyes glowing red, her face twisted in a ghastly grin. Some claimed they saw her standing in the middle of the road begging for help. Others claimed she had climbed into their trucks, only to vanish moments later. No one had ever returned from an encounter with her. The stories of the white woman had been circulating for decades, but it wasn't until Ethan's disappearance that the tales took on an even darker tone. People spoke of the curse that plagued the highway, a curse that had started long ago with the tragic death of a woman in a car accident. They said her spirit had never found peace and that she wandered the highway at night, seeking vengeance on anyone who dared to cross her path. Despite the warnings, some drivers, out of necessity or curiosity, continued to pass through the highway. One such driver was Marcus, a veteran trucker who had heard the rumors but never believed in ghosts. He had seen plenty of strange things on the road, but he always chalked them up to fatigue, stress, or the wild imagination of a lonely driver. However, as he neared the stretch of road where Ethan had disappeared, he began to feel an uneasy sensation. The air had grown thick with fog, and the road stretched out in front of him like an endless abyss. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and his hands tightened around the wheel. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just the isolation of the road getting to him. But then he saw her, a woman in a white dress standing by the side of the road, her eyes glowing red. Marcus slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. He stared at her in disbelief, his foot frozen on the pedal. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The woman stood there, unmoving, as though she were waiting for something. Without thinking, Marcus threw the truck into reverse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get away, but it was as if the road was closing in on him. The woman moved toward the truck, her slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence. Her red eyes never left him. The temperature inside the truck dropped, and Marcus's breath came out in visible puffs. His hand shook as he reached for the ignition, but the truck wouldn't start. The woman's laugh filled the air, an eerie, bone-chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His vision blurred as his heart pounded in his chest. Panic set in as he tried to force the truck into gear, but it wouldn't budge. And then, in a blink, she was right there, standing just outside the window, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. Marcus tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was constricted, his chest tight. His hands clutched the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling into madness. The woman reached toward him, her cold, bony fingers grazing his face. Her eyes burned into his soul as she whispered, "You can't escape." The last thing Marcus remembered before losing consciousness was the feeling of icy fingers closing around his heart. When he woke up, he was lying in the middle of the road, his truck nowhere in sight. His body was frozen with fear, his mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. He couldn't speak, his voice had been stolen from him. All he could do was stare wide-eyed at the empty highway. Marcus was never the same after that night. The once confident and fearless trucker was now a shadow of his former self. He could never shake the memory of the woman in the white dress, and he would never drive that highway again. The stories of the woman in white continued to spread, growing darker with each telling. The highway became known as the Ghost Road, and no one in the area dared to travel it after dark. Drivers who had once passed through with ease now avoided it entirely. Some had heard the stories and left, while others, like Marcus, had never been the same after their encounters. As time passed, the highway grew more desolate. Trees grew thick on either side of the road, and weeds began to overtake the asphalt. The once bustling route became nothing more than a forgotten path, whispered about in the darkest corners of the town. But despite the rumors, there were still those who sought to uncover the truth. Among them was a group of paranormal investigators, led by a determined journalist named Sarah. She had heard about the disappearances and the chilling stories of the white woman, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. Armed with cameras, microphones, and equipment, she and her team ventured to the heart of the Ghost Road, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. As they set up for the investigation, the atmosphere grew heavy. The air seemed thicker than usual, and the temperature dropped, despite the warmth of the summer night. Sarah could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, the unnerving sensation of being watched. They began recording, asking questions into the darkness. But the night was eerily quiet. No animals stirred, no winds blew. The only sound was the occasional rustling of their equipment. Then, without warning, the woman in white appeared on the screen of their camera. The team froze, staring at the blurry figure that had just materialized. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, but as the figure came closer, it became clear this was no illusion. The woman in white stood before them, her face twisted in pain and malice. Her red eyes glowed eerily in the darkness, and her mouth opened to reveal a mouthful of sharp, jagged teeth. The air around them grew colder still, and the woman's laughter echoed, filling the investigators with dread. Panicking, the team tried to run, but the van wouldn't start. The woman's figure moved closer, her form becoming more tangible, more solid. Her cold fingers reached for Sarah, and with a final scream, she was pulled into the darkness, her fate sealed by the woman's curse. The footage from that night was never released. The investigators disappeared, never to be heard from again. Their faces were left frozen in terror, their lives claimed by the ghost that still haunted the highway.